The day after the Mexican Grand Prix, US naval forces in the Persian Gulf attacked and destroyed two Iranian oil platforms in retaliation for Iranian missile attacks on Kuwaiti oil tankers a few days earlier. The US Navy gave a 20-minute warning to evacuate the platforms, which were no longer producing oil but had been converted to military use. Reporters asked President Reagan if this constituted an act of war, to which he replied, "No, we're not going to have a war with Iran, they're not that stupid." But Reagan had other things to worry about then. Not only was his Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork about to be rejected, but on the Monday after the race, the New York Stock Exchange suffered a catastrophic collapse in share prices, a drop which was echoed in major stock markets around the world, especially in Hong Kong, where share prices dropped up to 45%, and London, where trading had already been suspended on the Friday following the Great Storm. Even the least affected of the major stock exchanges, Vienna, lost some 10% of its value. Although stock prices began to rally soon afterwards, and the Federal Reserve stepped in to cover some of the debts, Black Monday, as it became known, shook faith in the underpinnings of the US economy and triggered recessions of greater and lesser length and severity around the world. Japan would ride the wave fairly well, for example, while New Zealand was unusually badly affected and would take years to fully recover. A different type of disaster was averted in the skies above the UK, where the pilot of an RAF Harrier fighter jet inadvertently ejected from the aircraft in flight, apparently while trying to adjust the height of his seat. An American C-5 Galaxy cargo aircraft in the area made visual contact and confirmed that the Harrier was continuing to fly straight and level, but with a broken canopy and no pilot. Fortunately, the American pilot had recently treated himself to a new video camera and was able to send videotape back to the RAF, and the Galaxy tracked the Harrier until, running out of fuel, it plunged harmlessly into the Irish Sea. Sadly, the Harrier pilot, Taylor Scott, was killed when he was unexpectedly dragged through the cockpit canopy, and his body was found a few days later, but it could have been much worse. And in slightly more uplifting news, British Rail's flagship train, the Intercity 125, broke the world speed record for a diesel-powered train, hitting 147.88 miles an hour, or 238 kilometres an hour. The previous record of 143.2 miles an hour, 230.5 kilometres an hour, had been set in 1973 by the prototype of the same train. And the F1 teams arrived in Japan for the first time since 1977. On that occasion, James Hunt had won for McLaren at the Fuji Speedway, the same track he'd secured his title at the year before, and Riccardo Patrese in his rookie year scored his first career point for Shadow. But Fuji was never popular, and the gang were all keen to see another new circuit, Honda's own track at Suzuka with its unique figure-8 configuration. Honda's success in recent years, and the presence of local hero Satoru Nakajima on the grid, had given Formula One a huge popularity boost in Japan, and with the Suzuka track set within Honda's own theme park, there were so many applicants for the 100,000 tickets that they had to be assigned by lottery. Satoru Nakajima had come under plenty of fire from pundits all year. His was, of course, the car equipped with a camera, and there were always suggestions that the extra weight and drag were not helping his performance, alongside less kind suggestions that he just wasn't up to the job. Here on his home track, he was the centre of media attention and looked to be taking the criticism in good heart, swapping banter with the BBC's veteran commentator Murray Walker before the race.
It's not the camera that's the problem, Senna, son. Thank you very much. Now, I have something to say. This is very kind and generous of you, and I appreciate it. But in England, we have a tradition. When you give a gift, you receive a gift back. I have a gift for you. It is a lens cap.
Soichiro Honda himself would be present, of course, and would be hoping to see the triumphal crowning of Nelson Piquet as champion. The best Mansell could do here was take it to the final race, though a win for Senna in his Lotus Honda, or even Prost, who would have Honda power behind him next year, might also be acceptable. Looking to spoil the Honda party were the ever-improving Ferraris, while the Benettons were also beginning to look like dark horses. Fabi's contract hadn't been renewed for 1988 and he would probably be returning to IndyCar racing, so there was also speculation on who might be replacing him, with Alessandro Nannini and British Formula 3000 hotshot Johnny Herbert both rumoured. Other news for 1988 was that the March team would expand to 2 cars with the addition of Brazilian driver and Senna's old housemate Mauricio Gugelmin, who'd been testing this week with the current March with next year's Judd engine in the back, which had gone well. Good news for Williams and Ligier, who were also signed up to use Judd power in 1988. And finally, another rule change for 1988 had been announced, with no part of the car, other than the tyres of course, now permitted to touch the ground at any point. This would do away with the titanium skid plates affixed to the bottom of most cars' gearboxes, which struck dramatic sparks during the races, something the fans at least would be sorry to see disappear. There was one change to the entry for this race. AGS parted company with Pascal Fabre and instead brought in Brazilian Roberto Moreno, who'd been testing with them recently and had been confirmed as their lead driver for 1988. Roberto Moreno had last been seen in Formula One at the 1982 Dutch Grand Prix, where he substituted for an injured Mansell, but had barely sat in the car before and failed to qualify. His stock fell somewhat in the interim, but the ever-cheerful Moreno, a childhood friend of Nelson Piquet, tried his hand at Formula 2, Formula 3000 and IndyCar, albeit without a huge amount of success, although he did win the Australian Grand Prix in 1981, 83 and 84 in the years before it became a championship race. His determination was finally given some reward in the shape of a call-up by the struggling AGS team. Will he be able to make the most of this second chance? Friday's qualifying on the new circuit saw Piquet take an early provisional pole, and Mansell was pushing hard to beat his time when he clipped a curb and lost control in the S's and spun hard into a tyre wall. Nigel was clearly in pain, though still conscious, and was complaining of back and shoulder pain, and eventually Professor Sid Watkins decided that he couldn't let Mansell race, and just like that, Nelson Piquet was world champion. Much as he didn't really get on with Mansell, he surely would have preferred to win some other way. He certainly lost no time in reminding everyone that Nigel's accident wasn't the only reason he'd won the third title. With the pressure now off, and perhaps wary of having an accident himself, Piquet did improve his time a little on Saturday, but not so much as others, and it was Gerhard Berger's Ferrari that sat on pole for the first race at Suzuka, alongside Alain Prost McLaren, with Boutsen an excellent third, alongside Alboreto, then Piquet, the first Honda runner, in fifth. In fact, the first race this year without a Honda on the front row, not exactly to the Japanese firm's script for this race. Teo Fabi was 6th, Senna 7th, then Patrese and Johansson. Nakajima had his best qualification yet, the only man who had driven the track before, but still only 11th. The Arrows pairing were further back than they have been recently after more engine woes. Chiva blew 4 Megatron BMWs on his way to 12th, then Nannini and the Zaxpeeds. Alio was first of the atmospheric cars, re-establishing himself over Dalmas, who was 23rd, and bringing up the rear was Roberto Moreno, ironically once again profiting from Nigel Mansell's misfortune to make his first Grand Prix start. Mansell himself was back home on the Isle of Man by the time Sunday's race began under chilly grey skies. The starter held the cars for a long time, and Alboreto's clutch began slipping, and when they finally got away, the 4th place Ferrari stayed put as everyone streamed around him. Unseen among the dust and tyre smoke, Arnoux moved over to avoid the stationary Ferrari and punted fellow white-helmeted Frenchman Alliot into the barriers, his race over before he'd even reached the start line. Alboreto received a push start and got going with it all to do from the back. Back at the sharp end, the order was Berger, Prost, Boutsen, Senna, Piquet and Fabi in the top 6, chased by Johansson, the Brabhams, Nakajima and the Arrowses, Warwick duelling with Nannini. By the end of the first lap, Berger was already opening out a lead from Prost, which was increased significantly when the McLaren picked up a puncture and had to limp round to the pit for new tyres on lap 3, leaving Berger with a 6-second lead over Boutsen in second place. The Belgian had Senna right on his rear wing, with Piquet, Fabi and Johansson following closely behind. Adrian Campos posted the first mechanical retirement on lap 3 with another blown Motori Moderni engine, as Boutsen began to leave Senna behind to worry about Piquet and his mirrors instead, with Fabi and Johansson ready to pounce on any opportunities. Behind them, Nakajima was going great guns, now up to 8th and threatening Patrese's 7th place. And equally impressive was Alboreto, who had already charged up to 11th, although the Fuji TV directors were understandably more interested in watching the Lotus. The other Lotus, driven by Senna, had meanwhile caught back up to Boutsen, who was suffering clutch problems, and soon got past, followed by Piquet, Johansson and Fabi. Nelson, keen to prove he hadn't won the title by default, was right on Senna's gearbox, and Johansson was still hanging grimly onto the pair of them, still with no drive for 1988 and keen to make an impact. And all the while Berger was cruising away in the lead, now some 12 seconds ahead, and easing off on his lap times to try and husband his fragile engine. Capelli, who'd been leading the 3.5 litre category, disappointed his own Japanese sponsors by binning his march into the barriers on lap 15, by which time Alboretto's charge had brought him up behind Nakajima, and therefore onto the TV coverage. And they all moved up a place when Fabi toured into the pits with what turned out to be a terminal engine fault. On lap 20, Johansson was the first of the leaders to make a tyre stop as the battling Brazilians ahead of him lapped Moreno. The McLaren team turned Stefan round quickly and off he went, while his teammate Prost was another man on a comeback drive and was past Nakajima, who pitted from 7th shortly afterwards. Unseen by the cameras, Warwick came in for his own tyre stop, only to find the Arrows pit occupied by Eddie Cheever, so he had to go right through and round again, presumably uttering some choice Hampshire oaths. On lap 24, just before half-distance, Berger wound his way through the sinuous pit lane and made a scorching sub-7 second tyre stop to retain his lead. Senna and Piquet came in together the next time round, and Senna had the quicker stop, and they re-emerged third and fourth. So once all the stops had shaken out by lap 27, Berger led Johansson by about 4 seconds, with Senna and Piquet still close together, about 11 seconds behind the Swede, Alboretto now 5th, about 15 seconds behind the Brazilians, and Boutsen still hanging on to 6th, with Nakajima, Patrese and Cheever following, and Palmer now leading the 3.5 litre category. Johansson was on a charge, scenting a long-awaited maiden win of his own, and was within 2 seconds of Berger as they made their way through traffic, while Nakajima had finally passed the ailing Boutsen to make his way into the points. Berger sped up a bit, opening out a gap to Johansson once more, as Brundle once again climbed out of a Zaxbyed with a blown engine on lap 33. Berger rapidly expanded his lead back out to 6 seconds over Johansson in just 2 laps, and having made his point, Berger eased off again. Not easing off was Prost, still flying and setting another fastest lap as he made his way into 7th and approached the Senna-Piquet scrap to unlap himself from both of them. Piquet let him through easily enough, as did his future teammate Senna. In fact, Piquet seemed to be dropping back quite a bit, and suddenly the Williams engineers were preparing to receive him. He went past the pit lane entrance that time, but it seemed that not all was well with the Williams. In fact, it transpired that he'd been following Senna so closely for so long that his radiators had accumulated lots of rubber and his engine was beginning to overheat. Moreno's solid but unspectacular debut ended with an electrical failure after 38 laps, 6 behind the leaders, and then a few laps later Piquet's engine finally gave up the ghost and he trickled into the pits to retire, splattering oil all over the pit, an ignominious end to what should have been a triumphant race for him. Alex Caffey almost made it to the end of the race before running out of fuel thanks to that thirsty Alfa Romeo engine, and Arnoux had the same problem at around the same time. Boutsen had got back ahead of Nakajima into 5th by that point, and the Lotus was coming under pressure from Eddie Cheever's Arrows. With just 3 laps to go, Eddie got past to take the point, only to run out of fuel himself on the last lap, weaving as Berger flew past on his final lap, gifting it back to Nakajima. Berger cruised to his 2nd career win, a dominant lights-to-flag victory to end Ferrari's losing streak of over 2 years. The unfortunate Stefan Johansson, having had to dial back the boost to eke out his own fuel, was pipped by a charging Senna on the very last corner, as Ayrton saved a little face for the otherwise grim-looking Honda contingent with 2nd place. If Alboretto, 4th, was unhappy that it was Berger rather than himself who took that long-awaited win, he didn't show it, giving Berger a big hug and telling journalists later that it only matters that the team won. Boutsen might have hoped for better than 5th at the start of the race, but he'd done very well to hang on with a dodgy car for so long. And Nakajima was a bit fortunate to come in 6th, but had looked good value for it for a change and got a hearty cheer from the crowd as he crossed the line. Prost was 7th, a lap down and crossing the line just behind Berger, and then Jonathan Palmer brought the Tyrrell home 8th and 1st in the 3.5 litre category to win the Jim Clark Cup overall.
We've had a few spills. Of course, Spain was a big disappointment for me when I was leading, and would have been in with the chance for points finish when a certain French driver ran in the side of me. But it's been challenging, and I think because the racing has been so close, and because it's been so important to get the car optimised and really not make any mistakes. Fine detail stuff has really made the difference this year between winning or losing, and that's really how motor racing should be.
So, the Honda script had been thrown in the bin, Ferrari were back on top again, and all 4 championship races had been sewn up, with 1 race still to go in 2 weeks' time in Australia. But there were still things to be decided down under, not least second place in the title race, with Senna now just 4 points behind Mansell, and there would be plenty of drivers wanting to put themselves in the shop window for 1988.